Now, when you think of the most peaceful country in the world, you probably think of countries like Iceland or Switzerland. I mean, after all, Switzerland has been known throughout history to take a neutral stance on conflict. And Iceland. I mean, it's almost impossible to cause trouble for your neighbors when you don't have any. Well, it's certainly true that these nations have managed to maintain peace for such a long time. Europe hasn't really seen all that much conflict in recent years. But the same cannot be said for a region like the Middle East. Since 2000, there have been 26 major conflicts in the region, making it one of the most war-rampant regions in the world. Though what if I told you that there has been one singular nation that has managed to avoid all of the conflict? And no, it isn't the United Arab Emirates or Qatar. While these places are incredibly safe, they still have had their fair share of domestic and international conflict. The country I'm referring to is Oman. For nearly 50 years, Oman hasn't fought in a single war and has facilitated peace and harmony throughout the Middle East since then. The country isn't located in the safest of locations either. Their neighbor, Yemen, has experienced 11 wars since 2000. So, how has Oman managed to stay out of conflict and remain peaceful, while in one of the most geopolitically unstable regions in the world? Well, the country wasn't always so peaceful. You see, in the late 17th and 18th century, Oman looked very different than how it does today. The Omani Empire was a vast maritime empire that reigned over parts of Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and even East Africa. At one point, the empire even visited New York City, meeting with the vice president and the governor of New York, making it the first Arab envoy to ever set foot in the New World. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, and in 1856, upon the death of the Sultan, a succession crisis occurred, and with British mediation, the empire was split up between the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, and the Sultanate of Zanzibar. As Oman's power began to fade, British influence over Muscat grew, and by the end of the 19th century, the Sultanate was dependent off of Britain. They would be consulting Britain for anything relevant and heavily relied on British funding. They essentially became a de facto British state. The Sultanate enjoyed relative peace under Britain until 1954, when Oman's first war began. After not finding any oil in the Sultanate, Britain began to occupy land in the Imamate of Oman, an autonomous region in the interior of Oman. This war eventually ended in 1959 with a British victory, resulting in the Imamate of Oman being dissolved. At the same time, a separatist movement began to develop and took the form of the Dhofar Liberation Front, a communist militant group heavily backed by the South Yemeni government. Britain didn't like the sound of that. They didn't want to risk their oil being taken by the commies. In the 60s, Oman was an incredibly underdeveloped nation. The Sultan, Said bin Taimur, outlawed almost all technological development and relied on Britain to do everything. To put this into perspective, there were only 3 schools in the entire country. The literacy rate was at 5%, and there were only 10 kilometers of paved roads. The Sultan was a terrible leader. After he was nearly assassinated in 1966, he banned football and made it illegal to wear sunglasses. He also made it illegal to have a conversation for longer than 15 minutes. At this point, everyone hated the Sultan. Even Britain was growing tired of him. Britain decided that the Sultan's son, Qaboos bin Said, would be the perfect replacement for his father. For 4 years, Qaboos had been under house arrest by his father, who hadn't spoke to him in 14 months, even though they lived in the same palace. The British government eventually managed to make contact with Qaboos and informed him of the plan to overthrow his father, which he agreed to. The troops arrived at the palace and met no resistance, as the 500 guardsmen stationed out front of the palace were persuaded by the British to stand down. The Sultan grabbed a pistol and then, whilst trying to cock the pistol, accidentally shot himself in the foot. That marked the end of his rule, as bin Taimur reluctantly signed the document for his abdication and handed the country over to his son, Qaboos bin Said, on the 23rd of July, 1970. So, what are they going to do with him? Should he be imprisoned? Executed, maybe? How about we let him peacefully live the rest of his life in a 5-star hotel in central London? He only did live for 2 more years, though. The insurgency was eventually ended with the help of the Shah of Iran. Jordanian troops sent from King Hussein of Jordan, British, Saudi Arabian, and Pakistani forces. This marked the end of conflict in Oman, and where the country began to rapidly grow and modernize. Qaboos promptly began reforming the country and amending all the mistakes that his late father had made. He agreed to pardon all rebel groups and incorporated Dhofar into the newly formed Sultanate of Oman. Schools, hospitals, and wells began to be built for the population. Qaboos also immediately outlawed slavery. Yes, slavery was still legal under his father's rule. He increased spending on health, education, and welfare, and even established a national currency. During the Gulf War, Oman did not suffer any casualties, and primarily aided in supporting the coalition led by the United States. During the Arab Spring of 2011, protesters demanded political reforms, improved living conditions, and the creation of more jobs. The Sultan then created more job opportunities and improved benefits. Oman was one of the only countries that was both an ally of Iran and the USA and would mediate peace talks between the two nations, which eventually led to the historic International Nuclear Pact. In 2011, 3 American hikers were accused of being spies and subsequently arrested by the Iranian government. They were only freed after Qaboos personally paid $1 million for their release. During the Yemeni civil war, Oman was the only nation of the Gulf Cooperation Council to not participate in the war, and also stayed on the sidelines during a dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar in 2017. Despite the country not having diplomatic ties with Israel, Qaboos met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 2018. On the 14th of December 2019, Qaboos was reported to be terminally ill with colon cancer in a Belgian hospital and returned home, wishing to die in his own country. Qaboos passed away a month later, at the age of 79. Under Qaboos, Oman went from a poorly developed British puppet state, rampant with war and disease, to becoming one of the Middle East's most peaceful countries. Oman is currently the fastest growing tourism destination in the Middle East, and the capital, Muscat, was named the second best city to visit in the world in 2012. Oman is also the only country in the entire Middle East where there hasn't been a single successful terrorist recruitment. Even countries like Japan or Canada that have a reputation for being very safe have still experienced acts of terrorism. After Qaboos's death, he named his cousin Haytham bin Tariq to succeed him as Sultan of Oman. During bin Tariq's first public speech as Sultan, he promised to uphold Qaboos' peacemaking foreign policy and to further develop the country's economy. He seems to be holding true to his statements as well. Since 2021, the country has been seeing positive economic growth, and recently, the Sultan has been involved in peace talks with Houthi rebels in Yemen. Oman serves as a prime example of how an absolute monarchy can either be terrible or great, and that even in a region like the Middle East, it is possible to maintain peace and not have any enemies.